wins, they try to deem it as authoritarian. But you should learn the tactics from the best. So, like, they want you to imitate people like Rosa Luxemburg and other losers, and they don't want you to imitate people who win. But that's why you should study people who win and see what they did in order to win. And so, in preparing this, I have 8 volumes of this book called Remembering Lenin. Can you see it?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I read some stories. And yeah, so we can talk about a lot of things.
Yeah. So basically we were doing that show. So we started doing the Sundays with Lenin. We started doing it on
Yeah,
Sunday afternoons.
and then I went to Donbass, and when I was in Donbass for a month, that's when we lost track. I wasn't able to do it because I was in a war zone.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we were doing that show, and what you would do is you would bring in someone that was not a Marxist-Leninist, like someone that you were trying to get them to read some Lenin and see if they could go
Be
along
better.
with that, like read better, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the Marxist-Leninists you got in there was Booker.
Omole.
Yeah,
He
and Booker
was the head of. He still is the head of the Communist Party in Kenya. He really knows his stuff. Unfortunately, so in Kenya they have a U.S.-backed puppet, and Kenya is involved in the U.S.-backed whatever is going on in Haiti, a gangsterism, U.S.-backed coup. And so he's been heavily critical of that, and they've been doing protests. Kenya also wanted to pass this IMF bill that tried to force austerity, et cetera, et cetera. And so, eh, so
yeah. Oh, we lost her for a second.
I tweeted it out now too. Hopefully, some people will come.
Yeah.
And so they've been protesting. And so the other day he was leaving Kenya to go to a conference in China. And before he was able to go to the conference in China, they arrested him off the airplane. And it looks like he's still in prison, although he's able to use his cell phone in prison in Kenya, or jail in Kenya, which is kind of different.
Yeah. I was noticing that. Yeah, so let me I'm just going to let everyone know that.
Yeah. Hello, Wumbu. What are the numbers next to these people mean?
The numbers next to them?
Yeah, there's like 5, 13.
They're gifters. That so TikTok is very monetary based. Like there's a lot of you gift in here and stuff like that. So a lot of times what we do in some of the lives now is we have people from Palestine or outside of Palestine trying to help their families and stuff. So they'll come in and we'll gift the person from Palestine so that they can.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I mean I should join back TikTok. I'll try my best. It's just been harder, but I will. I kept on. So I once put up a video of Zelensky's comedy skit, which basically contradicted everything he says as president. And then they banned me for it. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. All I did was I took Zelensky's own words in his own comedy skit and translated it, put subtitles on it. And I got banned. One of my accounts got banned for that.
Oh yeah. I remember that skit.
Yeah, no, it was hilarious. No, he's a very good comedian.
Yeah, TikTok can be very weird about, they're very sensitive. Like you got to be kind of careful on lives. Like sometimes on TikToks themselves, you can get away with saying certain things, but it just kind of shadow bans it. But yeah, on lives you have to be.
I put up a small clip of my documentary film from Donbass, and I got this was a few months ago. That was the last TikTok I put up, and that got taken down.
Yeah. I had one time I had a Martin Luther King, they told me was hate speech. I'm like, Martin Luther King, I don't think a hate speech came out of that man's mouth ever.
No way. Yeah, and they're
So,
very sensitive to being mass reported. So there was this one right winger, and he tried to say that Nicaragua, like, so Nicaragua had this thing where before the Sandinistas took over, the illiteracy rate was like, no, the literacy rate was about 30%. The illiteracy rate was 70%. Within 5 months, they had eradicated all illiteracy. And he claimed that was a lie. And then I asked him for his source, and his source actually like backed me up. And so I said, it looks like you could use some of Nicaragua's literacy lessons. And he got so offended by that, he had his fans mass report me, and I lost an account from that.
yeah, I mean it's this is tough. I had my account. I was doing okay because like if I did get a violation, I would like like kind of go off for a few weeks and not like do anything. So then the violations would kind of die down. But then I didn't even get like that much, but like just 3 in a row of people reporting, and then they just banned my account, and it was
Yeah,
on
I've gotten so many accounts banned. So, but I will come back with historically V3, hopefully in the next day or two.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I don't know. I want to just give it another couple of minutes because normally
Oh yeah.
In there.
I just came on early so I don't fall asleep.
I know. It's midnight for you, so it's
Yeah.
So you were doing this as a favor. We were thinking, like if we do lives, we'll just do it late night for you, but like mid
I
afternoon.
can do it at midnight. It's just I need a little bit of a heads up.
Yeah. So, I don't know why. Usually there's more people coming in here.
Well, we started early, so let's just wait a minute. And it doesn't matter how many people to me.
No, because we're recording it anyways, and it's actually going right now. I think, hopefully, I have it going all right on Twitter and on YouTube. It should be on
Excellent.
there.
So, yeah. And it's like so annoying that like people like Tom Cotton are like, oh, TikTok has communist. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Like they follow like they're even stricter than Twitter and Facebook and YouTube on how carefully you have to toe the NATO line.
Oh yeah, for sure. They're definitely like it's much easier to get away with stuff on Twitter than it is on TikTok now. So like it doesn't make any sense that they think TikTok is the bad social media.
I wish it were more like receptive to communist propaganda, but it isn't.
No, it's not at all. Not at all. We all like battle through that. So hello Nelson. I hope you had a good birthday yesterday.
Happy birthday, Nelson.
And yeah, so I don't know. Normally on this, it's Ghost of the Revolution, and we do a biopic or biopic of a person, of a revolutionary or a theorist or someone. But
well, I can get started with that. Feel free to interrupt me with questions. So on April 22nd, 1972, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanovsk was born in what was back then known as Simbirsk, Russia, but now it's been renamed Ulyanovsk after Ulyanov. So I went to visit it last year. It was a pilgrimage for me. And I saw the house he grew up in, and I even took a selfie from his living room mirror. And his dad was a teacher in the high school in Ulyanovsk, and he had many brothers and sisters. His mom was Maria Alexandrovna, and so he was closest to his brother Alexander, his oldest brother, who was a few years older than him. So one story that I really like is the one told by Olga Ulyanova, which is Lenin's sister. So when Lenin was about 6 or 7, his school would get out an hour early, but then people would, his dad wouldn't pick them up because it was kind of hard to pick them up back then. So he told him to go to Olga's class and hang out there until it was time for him to get picked up. Well, when he went to Olga's class, it was like a math class, and he started paying attention. And like after a few months, he was able to do all the math problems in Olga's class because he was hanging out that much. And he also learned how to read when he was 4, which was pretty early. And he was a voracious reader. One of my favorite anecdotes is one told by his brother Dimitri. So when he was 8, he read a book about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. And then after that, he went to his backyard and then he pretended to be a Cherokee. And then he told his brother, "Beware of white people. They will kill you in your sleep."
I was like
Which
that
is,
story.
yeah, and Lenin was always right, as you can tell, even from the age of 8. So he studied in the which is in what is now called the Vladimir Ilyich Gymnasium, which is like the school, but back then it was obviously not called that. But I don't remember what it was called back then. Um, and when he was about 13, his dad died. Um, and um, and then when he was about 14, what happened was that his brother Alexander was caught in the Narodnik movement. So the Narodniks were people who wanted to skip capitalism. So they thought that, so every other socialist theorist back then thought that that like basically if capitalism develops, it would eventually like empty out the villages, and then you'd have a big industrial proletariat, and then it would be easy for the industrial proletariat to come together and overthrow the bourgeoisie. And that was the theory that Marx advanced to. Well, what the Narodniks wanted to do is they wanted to kind of skip that phase of industrialization in a country and somehow just get the peasants to have like a, it was almost like a primitive commune, kind of like it was like a utopian society. But they went about it in the most creepiest way possible. So they'd have these like city dwellers who'd wear like peasant garb and go to villages, and peasants who are really, really oppressed back then. And that would really creep them out. So the Narodnik movement was not very fashionable. And then they also thought that if you were to assassinate key figures in the czarist government, it would cause people to like just spontaneously rise up against the czar. And that didn't happen. So they ended up assassinating Tsar Alexander III, or Alexander II. And then, sorry, Tsar Alexander II. And then his brother was implicated in that, and he was executed. So his brother was arrested in St. Petersburg, and they lived all the way in Simbursk or Ulyanovsk, which is way in the south. And back then, his mom had to take a horse carriage, like and travel like 100 miles before they could go to the train station. And this is the first time we realize how Lenin was disillusioned with liberals, because he went and asked many of their liberal neighbors to, "Hey, will you like accompany my mom because she's all alone on like a horse in the middle of nowhere in Russia?" And none of them did it. And so that's when he kind of understood that liberals aren't say good things, but they're not really going to help you when the time is in need. And eventually, his mom had to travel all alone. And Alexander was executed, and that had a very severe effect on Lenin because he was very, very close. But that also got him to, he started to study Marx much more heavily. And he kind of understood where the Narodniks went wrong. So then he graduated from high school, and then he started university in Kazan. And he started teaching workers how to read. And that was, and he'd call these like Marxist study circles, and they'd learn how to read by reading Marx. Well, unfortunately, his study circle in Kazan was busted. And so he got expelled from the university. He was studying law. but his mother was able to use her influence, and they were able to figure out a deal where they said that he can't come back to university, but if he can, if he sits he can take the exam without going to university, and if he passes, he gets a law degree. And then for the next 2 years, Lenin was in Kazan and sometimes in what's that other town? I don't know why it's blanking on me right now. It's not Symboursk.
It's all right. It's midnight.
Some well, it's I don't know why I'm having a brain activity problem. Some it doesn't matter. Samara, that's the town, Samara, and so he was there too, and there he met with many people. And one really interesting biography is there was this woman who was a blankist, and she was a few years older, and she was like one of the neighbors, and she would try to argue with Lenin about blankism is basically kind of like it's basically what is it? It's basically like you don't really have a plan or a theory. You just kind of try to build a military and try to overthrow it, but that doesn't work because in order to build like a people's army, you kind of need to have people who are really committed to it, who really know their theories.
Yeah, you have to have something to be fighting for. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I'm getting over a cold.
I know. I'm sorry. Your time.
Sorry.
Do you want something to drink?
No, I'm fine. It's just that I'm getting over a cold, and it's been. I still have a residual cough.
Blech.
And so then they would argue, but then she thought she'd win him over. But eventually she realized that blankism was like tried back in France, and it led to like a bourgeoisie Napoleonish government. So then she decides to become a Marxist. And then so after he studies, he goes to St. Petersburg, where at the age of 20, he sits in the exam, and he not only passes, but he becomes in number one in the entire university because he's so smart. So in St. Petersburg, actually it's one of my favorite letters. It's Lenin's first letter he sends to his mom. It actually sounds exactly like the letter you would send from your mom when you go to college. He's like at the end of the letter, he says, "P.S. I need more money."
Send me a basket.
No, he says, "P.S. Can you send me some more money?" He talks about how he got some work and blah blah blah. And in St. Petersburg, he ends up being very active with the workers. So he's not hanging out with the intelligentsia or anything. And so one of my favorite stories, again, it comes from one of the volumes of Remembering Lenin, where this worker asks about this concept having to do with worker unions and trade unions in Germany. So the next day, Lenin visits the worker quarters. Worker quarters in Tsarist Russia are really shitty. They're like, how do I explain it? They're like unhealthy. All these workers are crammed together. It's like very, very bare. And usually intelligentsia like didn't go there because you could get cholera. It was like built on small, like it was kind of like, yeah. Anyways, so he brings the book to the worker, and the worker says, "Wait, it's in German. I don't know how to read German." So he's like, "Okay, let's read it in Russian." So he starts like live translating the book while reading it for all the workers to listen to about how to form unions, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was a very cute story.
We were having a discussion about that stuff too, like people saying, "Oh, you don't need to read theory," and it's just like it's pretty important to learn this. And it's important enough for Lenin to translate it for people and have them learn how to read.
He
with
taught
it.
people how to read in order for them to read theory.
Yeah.
And another thing is when people are like, "It's ableist." So let me tell you what the working schedule in Tsarist Russia was. In 1884, the Tsar passed a law on protecting children, And it said that children between the ages of 12 and 15 cannot work more than 8 hours a day.
Yeah, between 12 and
So
15.
yeah, no more than 8 hours a day.
And that's includes Saturdays and Sundays. So
What?
it's not even a 40-hour week. It's a 60-hour week.
And they didn't even follow those laws.
Yeah.
But people worked the average I was looking at the statistics. So an average factory back then, people worked anywhere between 12 and 16 hours. And then there was a factory in Kiev where they basically said when the sun is out, you have to work. So sometimes in the summertime, they had to work up to 20 hours a day.
Yeah.
Despite working this long, they managed, like most of them didn't know how to read, couldn't go to school because they were working since age 12 or 13. They not only learned how to read theory, they first had to learn how to read, period. Then they started learning how to read theory.
Yeah.
So Lenin was in charge of one of these Marxist study circles. And this is a very cute story where on Sundays, this woman named Nadezhda Krupskaya was teaching, and Lenin would always want to hang out with her around that time. And she didn't understand why. She was like, oh, Lenin really loved discussing theory. And obviously that was not why. He was in love with her. Yeah. So what happens is that he asks, okay, but he kind of, so they meet up a few times. But then what happens is that their study circle gets busted and they're all sent to prison. And so while he was awaiting trial, Lenin writes the letter to the Tsar and explains look at how you exploit people and how you're a terrible person, blah, 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 while in prison. And I actually visited the prison he was in, and you can see his cell. It was like a small cell. And in prison, he learned how to do a secret note. So they would write in milk. And then if you put up the note in milk to a candle, it would then turn brown. So that's how they pass secret notes to each other. And so then he gets sentenced to exile in Shushenskaya. Mm-hmm. And at this point, he writes a letter to his mom asking her, can you meet up with Nadezhda Krupskaya? And then his mom not only meets up with her, but she proposes to her on her behalf, on Lenin's behalf. And then so they agree. And then so they get a special dispensation so that they can spend exile together. So then so Lenin's already in Shushenskaya, and a few months later she comes. But when she comes, like the priest's wife whisks her from the train and takes them to the church, and then they get married there. And they, and that's when they had their first kiss.
Yeah. Hi, Ivan.
Hi. So that was so cute and romantic.
I know. I love that the mother. I love that the mother had to do the proposal for him.
Well, he was in exile in prison.
Yeah. But no, it's just cute that, he just, he had that, like, I mean, he seems to have like such a sweet relationship with his mom and with his wife. Like,
he has a very sweet, he once gets mad at Stalin for yelling at his wife. Lenin's like a totally wife guy.
He's a wife guy. That's good though. That is good. But so then they get married.
I just talked about them. So now they're in exile, and when he's in exile, he keeps the postal service works, so he gets books, and he also ends up like hanging out with the local peasants. And when the local peasants have their small problems or any problems, like let's say the landlord took away their plow or something, he ends up like giving them pro bono legal advice. And he's so good at this that most people are just scared when they read a letter that they don't even bother going to court to litigate these issues. So he helps the local peasants that way. Yeah. And he gets to know some of the peasants. And so this shows you like the difference between Lenin and Trotsky in that Lenin understood the revolutionary potential of peasants. So Trotsky kind of thought that you needed the European proletariat to help out Russians, and Lenin knew better than that.
Yeah.
Um, so he knew that any revolution had to be a union between peasants and proletariat.
Yeah.
And because he got to intimately know so many peasants, like he'd go duck hunting with them, he'd go skating with them, like in exile. Like he was very integrated with the community. But also, while he was in exile, he ends up writing Development of Capitalism in Russia. So people understand how capitalism is going to develop and what's going to happen to the agricultural population, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So then he comes back, um, but after he gets freedom, he's still being dogged by czarist officials. But he travels around the country and meets with different Marxist groups and ends up making connections and teaching them how to organize, because they're all forbidden in czarist Russia.
Yeah.
And so they have to like organize in secret and stuff like that. But at this
Yeah.
point, he realizes that he's going to get arrested again. So then he flees the country and goes to Munich.
Mhm.
In Munich, he ends up writing What is to be Done. And he figures out what the problem was. Basically, anytime they had these like unions or any of these organizations, the czarist officials would wait for a little while, and then they'd, after it get at a critical mass, they'd come in and arrest all the leaders, and then that meant like that whole organization was pulled from down under, the rug was pulled, and then if any new person came, they had to restart over and over, and this process kept on happening. So he talks about what is to be done and how to do it. So the first thing he suggests is to have an all Russian newspaper where they talk about issues that are important to the proletariat, and instead of just having issues with the proletariat that are okay. So there was another thought called economism, where they thought that the proletariat should just like fight for better factory conditions and not try to take state power. And Lenin then explains no, because all of these things are related. So that's the first idea of intersectionality. So the oppression he feels at the factory is related to the Tsar's relationship with England and France, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important that we open their eyes and knit these different oppressions together so we can realize that we all are sharing the same oppression. And that is the main thesis of what is to be done. And so then they decided to form the Russian Social Democratic Party. And the Russian Social Democratic Party, they have a first meeting. It's supposed to be, and in order to form it, it's supposed to be in Brussels, but they are acting overly secretive. And then the Belgian police get really, really suspicious. So then they get kicked out. So they have to have the meeting in London.
Okay. So this is the German. Is this the German SDP, or is it?
No, this is the Russian
Russian.
It's
And
not
they're
related to anything.
creating
It's
it
just that they
in-
can't organize, have this meeting within Tsarist Russia.
Yep. Okay.
So, anyways, at this point, this is where the Bolshevik-Menshevik split happens. Lenin thinks in order to be a member of the party, you have to be a member of one of the feeder organizations, like one of the unions or something like that.
Mhm.
And then you have to pay dues. Marduk thinks like anyone who pays dues should be a member of the party. But because this is Tsarist Russia and they kept on getting cracked down, he don't want like any idiot to like just come in and join part, because you don't know if he's a spy or who he is. You want to make sure he's ideologically ready. And so then this is where the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks split. And then they also have a second issue. So the Bolsheviks think that in order to have a revolution, you need to have the proletariat and the peasantry unite. And the Mensheviks think that you should just like let capitalism develop. And after 50 years or so, Russia will have like enough of a proletariat population. And until then, you should like let the liberal bourgeoisie handle the state governance. And Lenin's like, wait a minute, if you let the liberal bourgeoisie do that, there'll never be a revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks split. And so yeah, so the Mensheviks go on their own way, and Bolsheviks are like, no, we want to do this. And so these two factions work as separate parties. But I mean, I'm skipping over the whole. There's a time where Mensheviks try to sabotage the Bolsheviks, blah blah blah. But that's a little.
Here's Trotsky at this point. Like, is
Trotsky's
he?
a Menshevik. Trotsky's a Menshevik until November of 1917.
Yeah. Okay.
And Trotsky's theory is a little bit different. Okay, so Trotsky thinks that after the revolution, instead of like trying to unite with the liberal bourgeoisie, what you need to do is agitate in Europe and get the European peasantry, European proletariat to come and help Russians. This is because Russia did not have enough of a proletariat population back then. There were about 2 million proletariats and 100 million peasants. So you can't really have like a dictatorship of the proletariat when you only have 2 million people. Like, it was not like developed, like it was not a Western country that had imperial profits that it could cannibalize. And so it just did not have enough of an industrial population. So Trotsky's workaround was to get Europeans to come and help.
Just for understanding, like the explain the peasantry of like how we view peasants now in America, but like what the peasantry was like back then.
They were like slaves, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, they were tied to the land. So the Tsar technically outlawed serfdom, but then peasants were given these communal lands that they couldn't sell, and they had to stay where they were. And basically, they had to give service to the landlords for like until they were basically able to buy their freedom. But that's never going to happen if you're like making peasant wages, which is nothing.
Yeah.
And then the landlords were able to cut off the best land, so they gave them crappy lands where they couldn't grow crap, and so it was not enough to feed people. And this caused many peasants to just leave and look for work and move to cities. And so that's how Russia got its industrial proletariat. The idea is that peasants technically have a place to live. So it's not like they're working with nothing on their backs. So the idea is that they're less revolutionary. But obviously this is not true, because if you're like a complete slave with like no food, like literally nothing, you're pretty revolutionary.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. So anyways, the Bolsheviks helped organize like thousands of strikes in factories and things like that. And then the Tsar started the Russia-Japan War at the behest of England, and Russia got its tail kicked by Japan. And so at this point, what would happen is that each landlord or village got to send some people to the army. And the village people, like the village owners or the landlords, they'd send people who were most problematic as punishment to the army, which in the end turned out to be a really bad idea.
Yeah, it did. Well, for the Tsar, it turned out to be a really great idea for Lenin.
But for the Tsar, so the way they were conscripting was that, like, let's say you were like organizing strikes, or you were like demanding more food or whatever, you got sent to the army as punishment for like misbehavior. Anyways, so then they came back like thousands of injured people, and Russia got totally humiliated. At this point, there was both a food crisis and an economic crisis. And so this caused lots of strikes. And at this point, even like liberal bourgeoisie people were like, yeah, we want to strike. And then so the Tsar at first tried to crack them down. So one really sad example is in January. Okay, I'm going to say I get the dates mixed up. So this may be the Georgian calendar and not the Gregorian calendar. But on January 5th of 1905, these proletariats go with the letter saying, "Dear respected our father Tsar, our life is hard, it sucks, blah, blah, blah. We have no food, we get paid like 6 kopecks, which is like 6, and we work like 14, etc., etc." So then they go to drop the petition to the Tsar at the Winter Palace. But the Tsar responds by shooting and killing everyone. And this is known as Bloody Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And like thousands have are died, and it's known as Bloody Sunday because in the Winter Palace, like the blood is all over the streets because of all the people they just killed. And this causes like every other factory in the country to strike, and they end up shutting down the country. Like all they organize, the Bolsheviks help organize strikes all the way from Warsaw, Poland, to Vladivostok, Russia. So that's two continents. That's like a lot, and they managed to do it within like a matter of weeks without modern technology. I don't know how they did it, but they did it.
Yeah, so like a big general strike happens.
Yeah, and it keeps on happening, and with more unrest. And then some soldiers who were sent as punishment end up staging a mutiny against the Tsar. They fail, but this scares the Tsar enough that he's like, okay, okay, let's have a constitutional monarchy. And so he gets one of his deputies, Bulligan, to create a fake Duma. So it's an advisory Duma. And the way you vote is depending on which class in society you belong to. So if you're a noble, you get like, there's like 60 seats for nobles, and they get to vote in the noble election. And if you're a peasant, you get like 3 seats, all peasants. So basically, it's like, it's okay. The US system is actually worse. I did a thing on Twitter a few years ago, but basically, it's like wealthy people get more democracy than poor people.
Yeah, like we're set up with because of the senators, just the way that they set it up, that the representation is all off, and then we have lawmen, so that's even worse. So.
Exactly. So at first, the Duma passed some bill that the Tsar disagrees with, so ends up dissolving it. And then he's like, okay, just kidding. We'll have another election. And so he goes on these shenanigans. And so at this point, one of his associates, Sergei Witt, realizes that the Tsar is kind of an idiot. And so they need to do something. So they end up passing a law that changes, that quote unquote kind of changes the present condition. So it says that instead of having communal land that are jointly owned based on like population for all the poor peasants, they finally have the right to own their own land. Mm-hmm. But if you're a poor peasant, where are you going to get the money to purchase your own land, even though you have a legal right to own it?
Yeah. You have access to land.
Yeah, in theory. But that still helps a few people. So there are thousands of new landowners, but not everyone has enough land to feed their family. So I don't know, like you need like 10 acres or something. And most people don't have the 10 acres in order to feed their family. So they're kind of screwed anyways.
Yeah.
But that creates a little bit of a hush. And so at this point, Lenin is still in exile. And he's still agitating. So the first strategy that the Bolsheviks take is to boycott this like farcical Duma. And they do this for about 2 cycles. But then in the 3rd cycle, the Tsarist officials decide that they're going to have a little bit, they try to separate the proletariat from the peasantry. So they try to give the proletariat a little bit more representation in the Duma. So at this point, these Russian Social Democratic Party is like, okay, we'll participate in the election. But Lenin's very clear on what you're supposed to do when you're in a bourgeoisie parliament. You're supposed to use your platform in order to bring out the absurdities to the people and make it clear why this law is stupid or why this law is BS and is not going to help people. You're not supposed to like water down your platform, but instead you're supposed to make it clear to people all the contradictions.
Yes.
So this continues. And at one point, Lenin is given amnesty and he's allowed back in Russia for a little while, but then he gets kicked out again.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyways,
where are we at now?
We're around 1910-ish.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
what Lenin starts noticing is that all these bourgeoisie countries are like warring with each other. For example, Spain and America are warring with each other, and at the end, like after the war, they end up like America takes Spain's colonies,
Yeah.
and Japan. And then there's Persia. England invades Persia, and so on. And then, so he kind of understands that there's going to be a war between the bourgeoisie states on how to divide the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then there is the Second International, where all the social democrat, back then they called them social democratic parties, get
Yeah.
together, and all of them promise that they will not vote for war credits in any imperial war. And they agree
Okay.
to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then in 1914, the German Social Democratic Party goes back on that promise and ends up voting for war credits in order to start World War One.
Yeah. Yep.
And of course, Lenin says, like, yeah, you can't, even in Europe, it's not about patriotism. It's about like, so Lenin has this really funny thing. It's like, the World War One is like about the robbers in Britain and the robbers in Germany fighting over who gets to rob Turkey of its oil. If you look at Turkey back then, it was Iraq, Syria. So that's the cause of World War One and every war after that.
Yeah. Like the German SDP just like totally went against the proletariat. They decided to back their, patriotism, back their.
That's not patriotism, but colonization.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So they start World War One, and World War One is one of the most ghastliest wars because they had modern technology but old techniques. People's faces would get blown off. There were like this phenomenon called broken faces.
Mm-hmm.
Since the Tsar was kind of like a British French puppet, he decides to join the war on the Eastern Front in order to crush Germany.
Yeah.
And at this point, they end up needing to conscript more soldiers. And where do they get these soldiers from?
The peasantry.
Yeah, the misbehaved. Yeah.
The
And
ones
now
that-
So I was reading this book, Believer Till the End. And this is a general, Vasily Kozlov, who was like grew up like as a peasant in like a really poor house, like they couldn't even afford pillows. Like their family had pillows only for special occasions when his mom's sister would visit. Like children got no pillows. They all slept in a one room, all the children. They used to have 9 children, but 4 of them died just because of diphtheria. Is diphtheria a real disease? Yeah. And then he mentions what happens when all these people get conscripted to World War One. So not only like did they not have enough labor to able to do food because these people were gone, so the food system collapsed and they couldn't grow food. So there was like a famine. And on top of it, you'd get more. So you had less people to work in the farms without any technology, and then you'd have all these people who come back who are like severely injured, who couldn't work in order to grow food, if that makes sense.
Yeah. They were hurt in the war, so
yeah, it was ghastly.
Yeah.
At this point, and because the rural peasants can't supply to city workers, the workers riot and strike, and they're like, okay, F this. Why am I working like 8 hours a day? Well, no, not 8, 14 hours a day when I can't buy food because there's no food to be bought.
Yeah.
And so this is when the Bolshevik Party has a really neat strategy. Like they suggest that people who are in bourgeoisie wars turn their gun on their oppressors instead of other proletariats.
Yeah.
And because they have so many disgruntled peasantry like within the army, because the Tsar needs lots of army, like they don't have the fancy weapons and things like that. Like they need, all they have is people. And in fact, the situation gets really bad for the Tsar, for Russian soldiers. Like at the front, they don't have enough shoes and it's effing cold here. Right now it's not, but usually it can be effing called. And so at that point, the idea of like just checking out of the war seems like a great idea. And then the czarist system is collapsing, but the czar himself is not independent. He has to follow what the British people say, and they're like, no, no, Russia has to stay at all costs in the war. And this creates.
Was there anything Russia was going to get from this? Like I never understood. Like, yeah, like the czar was doing this just as a puppet. Russia wasn't getting
on both sides.
Yeah.
So he was related to the English royal family on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, Russia was not going to get anything.
They were all related. They were just, it was like a family fight is what it was.
Exactly. And then Lenin also writes Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where he explains that because Russia was destined to be a third world country, it's always going to be exploited, and like you'll never get an industrial proletariat. Like even if you wait 100 years, 1,000 years, you'll never get enough of an industrial proletariat to follow Marxist theory. So you have to unite with the peasantry.
Yeah.
And then they start forming all these Soviets. So the soldiers decide to meet in secret and form a soldier Soviet. And then the czarist mail system collapses. But guess who's there to take over to create a shadow mailing system?
The Bolsheviks.
Because they had practiced delivering the newspaper that Lenin created in What Is to Be Done to thousands and thousands of people all over Russia. So they they had already created a shadow mail system. And so people were like, oh, so instead of like using the czar's mailing system, they're like, hey, here's a letter. Hey, Bolshevik, can you go send this to my cousin over there, kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and this made the
network instead of using the czar's network, they could just use, because the Bolsheviks were everywhere at this point.
Exactly. And then the Bolsheviks are also setting up things like soup kitchens and injury hospitals. So people who came back from war, they were like effed, but the Bolsheviks were like setting up these places where they could get bandages or whatever little medicine there was back then. And so then at this point, they gain immense popularity. In fact, a U.S. State Department official this is like around 1916, U.S. State Department official goes over, and then he's like, yeah, I didn't, like in some villages, I didn't see even czarist officials, but I did see a People's Deputy Soviet there.
Yeah. So they just, just picking up where the government was failing, people are noticing that. And so, people are coming more and more to their side.
Exactly. And this was a long process. It had happened over 10 years. Like it didn't happen like that. And then Lenin is still in exile. But then around April of 1917, they decide to sneak him back to, oh no, I forgot.
Uh-oh. I don't know if you just froze or what. Esha. You might have to drop and come back in. Hello, everyone. Hold on a minute. Let me just see. All right. Let me see if she... Okay. There we go. All right. That was a little break.
I can join video.
Huh?
Okay. Yeah. So sorry, I got so then so because the weapons factories strike, they're like, okay, you have to abdicate. So the czar abdicates and tries to hand over power to his cousin. Yeah. And then people are like, come on, do you think we were born yesterday? And so they continue to strike. And then so they go through 14 prime ministers in like 14 weeks or something like that. There, because the czar is trying out different puppets, and everyone sees through the ruse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally, even the West is like, yeah, this is not going to be tenable. You're going to have to resign. And then so the czar resigns, and then they try to set up a provisional government. The provisional government is filled with like the cadets and some Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, all these other parties.
Yeah.
And before they are provisional government, they're like, yes, of course, we're going to give amnesty to Bolsheviks and let them be legal, and they can like run in elections and whatnot. And we're going to totally have an actual constitution, and it'll be totally cool. But of course, once they come into power, they don't do any of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is when Lenin sneaks back into Russia. And it's a really funny story because he's under disguise and he's on a train. And then somebody in Poland says something wrong about the Constitutional Assembly. She's like, we're going to have a Constitutional Assembly next month. So then he like runs out of his disguise and then starts to argue with this lady on the train. And he almost gets caught because she looks at him really suspiciously, but luckily she has to leave Poland and she doesn't really notify the police.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he almost like lost his disguise because he wanted to, somebody was wrong on the train.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then where was I? April. Okay, so he comes back, and when he comes back to Petrograd, they called it Petrograd because St. Petersburg was too Germanic and they were having a war with the Germans. So they're like, okay, let's change the city name to Petrograd. And he's like in the train station, there's like a big crowd of hundreds of people are there to welcome him with roses and whatnot. And then he's forced to give this impromptu speech where he's like, yes, we're going to have a revolution and it's going to be awesome and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, and this is when he works on the April thesis, where he explained it's kind of like the blueprint on the revolution. And actually, between March of 1917 and July of 1917, he's like written more articles than he has in the past like 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so then what goes on, like?
So the provisional government first says, oh, we're totally going to have a constitutional assembly in July. And then they're like, psych. So then the Bolsheviks organize a big strike. And at this point, Bolshevik offices get raided, their presses get burnt down and stuff like that. And so at this point, they're like, look, the provisional government is not really going to have a constitutional democracy. They're like, they're kind of puppets to the West. And for the West, they did not want a constitutional democracy because once you let people vote, they're totally going to vote not to get their faces blown off for World War I, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
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 So the West did not want that in any cost.
Yeah.
In fact, they start setting up these like counter-revolutionary forces. Like, for example, they create Poland. They like get all these fake, not like Polish Americans and Polish Canadians to create an army which is trained in France, and then they drop them off in Warsaw as like a bulwark against any unrest, etc.
Yeah.
So then the Bolsheviks are like, okay, look, guys, we have to kind of have a revolution because this provisional government is just like the more of the same. They're going to continue with what the Tsar was doing. There's no policy change. We're not getting land. We're not getting food. We're not getting bread. There's no electricity, no wages, etc., etc. Yeah. And at this point, people who were on the fence about the revolution, they're like, yeah, you're right. The provisional government's kind of going to do this. And at the same time, the West has been secretly scheming, and they realize that Kerensky is kind of weak. And so they want to kill Kerensky and put up like another dictator in his place. And so so then they start planning, and then all the soldiers get together and secretly plan. And then they're like, okay, we're going to have a revolution on one date. But then Trotsky accidentally lets that date slip. and then so they have to like move it back, and this is the October Revolution.
Yeah.
So then Kerensky keeps lying to the West. So he keeps saying, "Oh, I have 100,000 soldiers who are loyal to me. I have 10 million soldiers. Blah blah blah. The Bolsheviks can't even have 50 people." Unfortunately for him, he has close to 0 soldiers. So it's really funny when you look at the State Department memos around this time. They're like, "Okay, Kerensky can mobilize up to 100,000 people." And then 2 days later, they're like, "Oh, we meant 50,000 people. Oh,
Yeah.
we meant 5,000 people. We meant, what?
5.
5." Yeah. It's really funny. Yeah. I was reading through it, and it's really, really funny.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. 'Cause they did all this work to get like the people on their side. So like the Bolsheviks are the majority. I mean, that's the people like them, right?
exactly. So then they end up invading Winter Palace and taking over the government. At this point, like the government soldiers are so disorganized they don't even fight. Like they're like, "Ah, F it."
Yeah.
And then so now the Bolsheviks have control over basically St. Petersburg, the road between St. Petersburg and Moscow, and half of Moscow.
Yeah.
And this is October/November of 1917. And then right after this, Lenin comes out of hiding, and he's required to make a speech. And it's really funny because he's like looks at Trotsky and he says in German, "What on earth did we get ourselves into?"
Yeah.
So he makes a speech, and then the very first bill that this Bolshevik provisional government ends up passing is the decree on land, bread, and freedom.
Nice.
So it says that peasants can take over land from the landlords. They don't have to give them any money. They can just like go, just take it. You guys can form a committee and you can decide how you want your new land to be divided.
Yeah.
Bread means everyone has the right to bread. And when you look at reactionaries who complain about bread lines in Soviets, what people don't realize is that a lot of times they're complaining about the fact that they are in the same line as peasants in order to buy bread.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you have to, everyone's the same. So you're going to get your bread and they're getting their bread on,
In the same line. Yeah. It's like, I can't believe I have to stand in line with peasants, is like the main complaint about bread lines that most Americans don't realize.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not having, the privilege, not being special, not being treated special because you're special. You're much more special than a peasant.
Yeah. So at this point, people realize, hey, the Bolsheviks really mean it. I like it. But then of course, empires always strike back. They just you can't. They just don't like like in the U.S. when slavery ended. Did the slave owners just go right off in the sunset, or did they form the KKK?
Yeah.
And so the landowners and the landlord class and the czar's class get together and they form the white armies.
Yeah.
Which is not that different than the KKK.
Yeah.
And they are horrific. So what they do is in villages, like they target Bolshevik officials, like by like gouging out their eyes or cutting off their arms. Like there are some horrific stories. So there's this one guy, his name is Admiral Kolchak. And he is backed by the US. The US loves him. They're giving him lots of weapons and stuff like that. And his job is to conquer Siberia. So there's this one hospital where they have a big outbreak of like the flu. And his solution, you know what it is?
What?
On how to stop the outbreak?
Of the flu? Probably just let certain people die. Yeah.
No, kill everyone in the hospital.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, this was so horrific. A State Department official was like, "What the F?" So they are, and so what you don't understand is Bolsheviks, like, well, seem like government officials. they're peasants who can't read and write. They're like poor people who decided to be the head of like a committee. So they're targeting like the poorest in society and stuff like that. And so that starts with, so because the Bolsheviks are getting killed, they can't really have a fair election for the Constituent Assembly when people in the most popular party are being murdered left and right. So Lenin's like, okay, well, you guys are not playing by the rules. Okay, we are not going to have this election. And then end up changing the rules for the election. So instead of like having a multi-party system, it's like you have to be no party and you have to be nominated by your whole village, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Anyways, but then the West, at this point, the Bolsheviks also check out of World War I. They're just like, okay, bye-bye. And so all these soldiers end up leaving. And so it gives Germany a little bit of a breathing room. But the West really does not like this at all. And so then, but what they don't realize is that after looking at the Bolsheviks, at the Russian soldiers check out of World War I, the Austria-Hungarian Empire soldiers in the Austria-Hungary were like, F this. So Croatian soldiers come back. Soldiers in the Ottoman Empire, like Serbian soldiers, come back, and they form the kingdom of the Serbs, Slovenes, Croats, also known as Yugoslavia. And so when they're doing this, what happens is that it ends up destabilizing all the other empires. Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, the Ottoman Empire collapses because they don't have any soldiers to protect them anymore. And so this creates a big chaos. And then suddenly the bourgeoisie are like, oh, F, we can't fight amongst ourselves because we all need to fight the Bolsheviks. So this is the time when the West not only gives money to all these Juan Guaido types, Contra types, but they also physically send their armies, 14 of them, 14 countries invade at once. And they don't understand this. The thing is that they don't understand the strength of the Bolshevik army. So they think, 100,000 people. And guess how many people end up being in there? 2 million. So then they start fighting. So the first thing they do is they end up conquering a bigger area, the Caucasus Mountains. But in these areas, they're like, the white guards are just horrific. Like I said, they literally like end up mass raping peasants. They have the first concentration camps. They end up killing Jews, just like horrible, horrible stuff. And because they're so horrible, people who were on the fence are like, oh, we don't want these psychos. I like the Bolsheviks. And then at this point in 1917, the workers themselves form a Soviet, and then they decide we're going to have 8-hour working days. That's the end. So Lenin didn't even have to do that because the workers themselves decided that. And they also banned child labor, etc. And so then the Russian Civil War is brutal and it's fought over many, many years. So then they end up conquering the Caucasus Mountains areas. And then at the last areas that they end up conquering is Ukraine and Siberia. Unfortunately, the fake Polish army is too well armed, and so they have to concede Poland. But then the Polish army realizes the Bolsheviks' kind of precarious situation, so they go in and invade half of Belarus and half of Ukraine and make that into modern Poland. And the Bolsheviks are kind of forced to sign a treaty. They're like, yeah, you took, okay, yeah, sure. So then the Civil War ends, but at this point, Lenin I forgot to talk about the time Lenin gets shot. One of the agents is literally given a gun by the U.S. state. The guy who the woman who shoots him, she's literally given a gun by the U.S. State Department. So you know who's behind it. Anyways, he ends up having his first stroke, and he does recover from his first stroke. And they're told that he should kind of not work too hard and relax, but he doesn't follow with this. And he sets up the program called LICBEZ, which means liquid bezgrammatnost is illiteracy. So it's called liquidation of illiteracy, where they set up these in the middle of a war, of course. They set up all these thousands of night schools where people can come and learn how to read and write. They have public libraries. They even set up a university in the middle of a world war, just so we know.
Yeah.
In case, people are like, oh, it's not possible, blah blah blah, to do whatever the U.S. government claims that they can't do. The Bolsheviks did it in the middle of a war.
As they're fighting off,
14
hours. Yeah. So, this is all stuff that can be done because it was important. It was important to get everybody educated and stuff at this point.
Exactly. Because you remember that tweet about how their grandfather in Poland, how communists use literacy as propaganda, and how his grandfather was anti-communist because he never learned how to read.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. There's been a couple of tweets that have just been funny about all that, but so I mean, that was that, and his wife was key in the literacy stuff too, right?
Oh, in fact, today's modern prize for literacy is called the Nadezhda Krupskaya Prize for Literacy.
Yeah. So
no, she was more than key. She basically, he suggested, he might have suggested the seed, but she organized the whole thing. And then unfortunately Lenin has his second stroke and he wakes up a few months later, but then soon after he has his third stroke and he departs from this world. Well, not quite. He's still around. His body's still around.
He's still in the world.
Yeah. His spirit departed.
So, well, that was all about Lenin.
A lot about Lenin, some about the Soviet. Well, I mean, I could have said more. There's some funny stories where he's obsessing over the font used when in the middle of the war, to print things, and it's like, don't do it. And when he first gets into power, he kind of has a hard time delegating. So there's some really funny letters, he gets involved in the most trivial tasks. So there's this one really funny letter where he's sending it to this one Ivanov in the town between Grozny and some other town in the Caucasus Mountains. And he says, can you please return the pharmacist's bicycle that you borrowed?
Yeah. I remember that one.
Yeah, it's like, oh wait, don't you have other? Yeah, so there's a lot of other funny stuff that I could have went on and on about. Go ahead.
Is there pieces by Lenin that you suggest that are not the larger pieces?
Once more about the State Duma. That's about centrism and why centrism does not work. Capitalism and armament. My favorite is there's two of them. There's one about European civilization and Asian barbarism. Yeah, that's actually a sarcastic title, of course, because he talks about this judge in India who rapes a 9-year-old girl. So obviously he doesn't think Europeans are civilized.
So so that was stuff like that. So for right now, on the Historically YouTube channel, if people want to, a lot of these little pieces, I was explaining to some people, we would go on, we would get the person, and then you would have some ideas of maybe what you'd want to read with that person, but the person would start talking and you'd be like, oh, we got to read this. And it was you just have this, you have this knowledge of Lenin's works that you can discern from the conversation what fits in perfectly right there. And so the show that we did together was that it was picking the pieces that whatever we were discussing, it just would fit right into what we were discussing.
Oh yeah, and that's the sad thing is that one of my professors, he died recently, Alexander Buzgalin. And I said, why is Lenin still relevant 100 years ago? And he's like, it's because of capitalism. I wish he weren't this relevant because I wish the world had changed, but it hasn't.
I had a weird thought the other night, and I don't know, I was just sitting there and I'm like, oh my God, when we do, like, if we ever do get to this communism, we actually have to teach about capitalism and how bad it was, just so we don't slip back into it. Like, we can't even put it to rest. Like, we have to have the knowledge of like this bad stuff that happened. Like, we're
Oh
gonna
no,
have to.
you no more than that. That was the well, that is one of the things that happened with the Soviet Union. So people came back from World War One, and they're like, I don't want to I don't want to traumatize my little snowflake with all the horror of World War Two, of the
Yeah.
Holocaust and things like that. And so people who were baby boomers like had it too nice. They did not have the memory of like times they couldn't afford shoes and whatnot, and
Yeah.
their parents did not bother to tell them all the horrors of capital. In fact, this has happened all over Europe. So, and then their parents, hold on, I'm going to boil some. Uh, yeah, so their parents ended up like not telling them about all the horrors of capitalism. Like, so in order to save the Soviet Union, they had to be willing to fight another world war, and they weren't, because they didn't realize how horrible capitalism would be, because they grew up under communism, and like basic things like they didn't know, like, oh, under capitalism, for example, there are homeless people, and whatnot, and so on. And so yeah, that was one of the things that was the reason why the Soviet Union fell.
Yeah, my friend Rick is saying you need narratives about greed, like the Wendigo. Like, you have to like come up with like
Oh, actually, one of my favorite
horror
stories.
stories.
You don't need a horror
Go
story.
ahead.
You just need the truth.
Yeah, true.
You just need to explain what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your favorite story?
What?
You just said one of my favorite stories.
Oh, is Mr. Twister. It's one of my favorite. It's like a childhood cartoon from the Soviet Union. So it was written in 1933, and it's about Mr. Twister, who used to be a senator, and he owns like a factory in New York, and like a boat and stuff like that. And his daughter wanted to go to Leningrad for vacation, and so he's like, okay, let's go to Leningrad. And then they go to this hotel, and in this hotel, there's a black man there. And then Mr. Twister's like, oh my God, I need to leave this hotel. So then the hotel bell clerk realizes he's a racist piece of shit. So he ends up calls all the other hotels in Leningrad and says, hey, there's this guy named Mr. Twister, and he's racist. So when he gets there, tell them that you don't have any vacancy. So then he goes from hotel to hotel, and at each hotel they said, no room here. And then at the end, he comes back to his first hotel, and then he promises not to be racist. So then they're like, okay, we have a room for you. And then the moral of the story is that there's room for Malaysians, Chinese, Africans, and Bolivians in Leningrad, but there's no room for racists.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So, I think like this was good, and I think, I mean, you should probably come back and do some lives on here. I think, we didn't get the big audience here, but we can definitely.
It doesn't matter. It'll be here for when it helps me organize my thoughts for my book, anyways.
Well, that's what I was saying. Like, so that was one of the things I was thinking, and in doing this was like you were coming up with, talking to someone and doing kind of like that dollop thing, and I think that the more you get to talk about it, it's better for you, because you've been working on this stuff for so long now, So so you are welcome. Well, we can do it on historically. We can do it on here. We can cross it over. We can do whatever you want to do. So.
Okay.
Well,
does anyone have any questions before I go? Because it's 1:06 a.m. Although I'm hungry, so I might get some noodles.
You can eat noodles. I don't think anyone.
Yeah, I have to go buy noodles though.
Oh,
but the store is really close by.
No, I think we're good. I think you can go buy your noodles, and we'll be good. And we'll work out something, and probably do some more lives on historically too. So, and just for everyone here, I actually tried putting this up. I'll see if it went up right on YouTube, and I don't believe we're doing a show Friday night. You can join. Well, Esha and I may be doing a show on Saturday. We haven't worked that
Yeah,
out yet.
we'll figure it. We'll discuss it.
Yeah, so on historically, and then yeah, so next week on Reed, Aria will be back, and I believe we're talking about the disability and lumping and stuff like that next week. So that's what we'll be talking about at 5 Eastern Standard Time next Wednesday.
Okay, well, this was fun. See you all, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
And thank you for coming here, Esha. Thank you.
No worries. Bye.